Hi, my name is Josh Gellers, and today I'm going to present on Getting Robot Rights Wrong, a response to Frank Pasquale. This talk is motivated by the fact that there seems to be an emerging public discourse around a very controversial topic of rights for robots, and this has led to a lot of commentary by scholars and practitioners and so on, some of which is really hot air and maybe just science fiction postulating. But I think the important thing is that this is an issue that is probably not going to go away and is something that people are currently debating about. So if we're going to have a really robust public discussion about this, we should make sure that we're all on the same page. And so in the course of looking at what's been out there and what people have presented on the subject, I feel it's incumbent upon people who have written on robot rights to make some kind of commentary about others who have also discussed this issue in public forum. So on April 26th, 2021, the Carr Center for Human Rights at the Kennedy School at Harvard University had this presentation by Frank Pasquale entitled From Citizens United to Bots United, Reinterpreting Robot Rights as a Corporate Power Grab. Now, as someone who's written a book on this subject, of course, I was very interested. I did not get a chance to attend the talk live, but I appreciate that the Carr Center put this on their agenda and that they decided to have a whole session devoted to this subject. So I did watch the recorded video on YouTube, and what I'd like to do now is provide some commentary about what I see as some of the issues with arguments raised from those who think that robot rights are an unimportant or controversial or tricky issue to deal with, or something that we shouldn't even be thinking about at all. And so again, this is a topic that is discussed by Frank Pasquale, who wrote the new book, New Laws of Robotics, Defending Human Expertise in the Age of AI. So about halfway through the talk, Frank talks about sort of two schools of thought or areas of analogies used to discuss robot rights. And on the one hand, he talks about this analogy to humans, and on the other hand, he talks about an analogy made to animals. And the idea here is that these are both flawed analogies, but for different reasons. And it's perfectly acceptable to make analogies in the course of trying to understand a complex and controversial topic. But what we should really be curious about is whether we're doing so in good faith, whether the arguments stand up to scrutiny, and whether this is going to move the ball forward in terms of the kinds of debates that we're having philosophically, legally, and otherwise. So what I'm going to do here is go point by point and address each of the major claims that were made in the course of this slide and get to hopefully some semblance of understanding about whether these are in fact valid complaints about this topic of robot rights. And I should say at the outset that the title of the slide says the usual rhetoric of robot rights seems to suggest that there is a great deal of summarizing going on here, but as we'll see in a moment, that doesn't actually seem to be the case. So the first claim under the like humans part of this reads as follows, that talking about robots in terms of their relationship with humans tends to rely on what he calls a behaviorist ontology. Now, this was a phrase that I had never read about before in any of the literature that I've read on robot rights or artificial intelligence rights and things like that. And I looked it up, and there's very little literature at all about this particular phrase. But I think I get the gist of what Frank is discussing, and so I'm going to talk about that in a moment. On the bright side, he does mention an article that he wrote a little while back called The Algorithmic Self, which is a fantastic article that brings up a lot of really important critiques about the way in which artificial intelligence is being utilized and the kind of suspicions that we should have about how they're going to affect humanity, all of which are very pertinent to what's going on today in our political climate. But there's one piece of that article that I believe he is referring to when he talks about this behaviorist ontology, and that is that in some way the creation of human-like robots is a matter of deception or deliberate misperception on the behalf of humans, and that this is being foisted upon them by ne'er-do-well corporations, all of which might actually be true. But the point that I want to highlight here is, as many scholars before me have talked about, there is an innate human tendency to anthropomorphize not only robots, but lots of other things. And so to come against this through the charge that this is something we need to push back against and that we're being manipulated. Again, it very well could be the case that we are being manipulated by companies who are trying to seek profit or by government entities that are seeking to increase the surveillance state. But the reality is that humans are going to innately have this drive to do this kind of anthropomorphizing of inanimate objects or non-humans. And so instead of pushing against that, we need to understand more about why that happens, the conditions under which humans are more likely to anthropomorphize, and the consequences of that. And then just as a side note, he talks about this classic thought experiment about removing individual brain cells and then replacing them with artificial ones, and that having an important comment about the extent to which something that is potentially artificial could be considered to have moral status or not. But again, if we're going to be very scrupulous in our analysis of this, what I wanted to highlight is that actually was not Pinker's initial thought experiment. That thought experiment appears in a 1992 book by philosopher John Searle, The Rediscovery of Mind, in which he talks about this in chapter 3. And so the second piece to this argument is that if the robot can do what some subset of humans does, to treat the robot differently is to discriminate. And this kind of signifies where he's heading in a moment. But what I'll say about this is that in the robot rights literature, very, very few people ever talk about this sort of performance that robots engage in, and that is in and of itself a reason why we should extend moral status or legal status to them. And an important philosophical tool here is the argument for marginal cases, which gets at this criteria problem about what are the sorts of properties that we associate with moral or legal status. So it's not so much what people or humans or people or robots are doing that is significant, but rather it is a result of the kinds of properties and what they may or may not inspire people or robots to do that many people have argued is morally or legally significant. The only person I could come across in my reading who has talked about something similar to this is John Danaher in his excellent article, Welcoming Robots into the Moral Circle, a defense of what he calls ethical behaviorism. I believe this is closer to what Frank was actually talking about in his comment here. So the second part of this is one that deserves a little bit more attention, and it's something that I talk about a lot in my book, which I'll discuss later on. So in the course of talking about this analogy between robots and humans, he says that this animates concerns about what he calls offensive horizons, that the comparison of, quote, suffering of robots to the real suffering of oppressed groups perhaps is something that is negative and problematic. And going off of a conference paper, which I'd also address in my book, he says that focusing on this issue in some ways diminishes the attention that we pay to human welfare. Okay, so let me take a moment on this particular line of reasoning. Virtually no one who writes about the rights of robots talks about robots actually suffering in the way that we understand humans to suffer, and that many people who write about animal ethics describe animals as suffering. So this is basically a straw man argument, because no one who writes on robot rights talks specifically about the suffering of robots as a reason why we should afford them moral or legal status. And as to the how this is basically a zero-sum game in which focusing on robot rights diminishes from the real hard work that needs to be dedicated to human welfare, I completely disagree with this premise. As someone who has only recently gotten into the robot rights literature as of 2020, I spent my entire career focused on environmental human rights and how the negative effects on the environment caused by things like development and capitalism, government malfeasance, and so on, has real negative impacts on humans and the environment that they inhabit. I think it's elitist and an example of academic gatekeeping to say that this is an important thing that we should be focusing our energies on, and this is nonsense that is not worth our time and no one should be discussing it. I mean, again, there's lots of work to be done. There are lots of interesting questions to be tackled. No one has a right to tell anyone else what is or is not important to discuss. And in fact, that's one of the arguments that people on the right tend to use when they're trying to diminish the importance of things like humanities. But we know from the study of AI ethics that if anything, we need more humanities inserted into the process of designing artificial intelligence, not less. So we don't want to give that side any kind of ammunition to discredit the work that's being done in the humanities, in the social sciences, and so on. So the irony of all of this, of course, to me, as someone who writes about environmental issues, is that I see the argument that is being raised by Frank and by the authors of this other conference paper as unwittingly falling into a trap that it allies them with some really nasty individuals who are quite honestly, as the name suggests here at the top image, trying to promote what they call human exceptionalism. They see that the world is currently embroiled in this war on humans because of the increasing amount of attention paid to non-human entities and rights being granted to them, especially animals, but also nature as well. So the very arguments that these people are making about why we need to redouble our efforts to focus on humans are logically the same kinds of argument used to say that humans are superior to all other life forms or all other artifacts that are out there, and that this is also an argument that places some humans above others, and we have already seen the harmful consequences of that kind of thinking, both in terms of human and human relations, but also in terms of humans and their relations to the natural environment. Indeed, one of the major insights of Earth system law and the concept of the Anthropocene is this idea that we have not paid attention to the effects that humans have had on the environment, and we have considered humans and the environment to be so long separate from each other that we have ignored the basis for our continued exploitation and degradation of the environment. So, sort of philosophically thinking, if we view humans as outside of nature and not acting upon it or central to it and intrinsically part of it, then for many people, like those in the Center on Human Exceptionalism, this gives us license to continue the kinds of deleterious impacts that we have already seen that have arisen to the level of an environmental crisis in terms of things like climate change. And maybe more colloquially, I have a little graphic here at the bottom, which illustrates this point about what I talk about as being able to walk and chew gum at the same time. We can focus on issues that are of dire and immediate importance, like human rights abuses all over the world, genocides occurring in corners of the world, and forward-thinking ethical, legal, and moral concerns like the rights of AI and robots. And another piece to this is also a very exclusively Western imperialist type of perspective. So for those people who are so dogmatically insistent that even the mere mention of rights for robots is heretical, I would encourage them to look at how the rights of non-humans and the moral and legal status of non-humans is viewed through a non-Western and indigenous lens. One great example of this is a series of essays, an award-winning essay, Making Kin with the Machines, which brings a lot of indigenous scholars to bear on the relationship between technology and indigeneity. And I think it would be particularly instructive for people who think that there is only one way of knowing about that world, the world that we live in, and that way is fundamentally Western in orientation. Then we shift over to the other side of that slide, which talks about the analogy to animals. And so the quote here is that robot rights have some origins in environmentalism. If trees or whales have standing, why not robots? First, it's a bit odd to see environmentalism under the guise of an animal analogy, because animal ethics, while certainly related to environmental ethics, has proceeded in a very different direction and should be thought of as a cognate and discrete area of ethics that is important in its own right. So it's a bit of a strange move to talk about this as being related to environmentalism, which suggests the environmental movement, and then melding together trees and whales under a slide that's talking about animals. This is something that I have focused virtually my entire book on, and so I would encourage people who are interested in the intersection of the rights of animals, the rights of nature, and the rights of potentially robots to check out my book, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And then also confusingly, in that same slide, he talks about that this argument tends to ignore the distinctiveness of the natural environment as a foundation for its special valuation. This seems to suggest, using the language of environmental ethics, that Frank is talking about intrinsic value, which has been something that has been debated about in environmental ethics for a really long time. Again, I can only infer that's what he's talking about because he doesn't actually use the language when he's describing this. But there are also many other ways of talking about environmental values, and intrinsic value is really only one of them. And the image that I have here illustrates another sort of school of thought within environmental ethics, which is ecocentric ethics, which moves from the bottom image where humans are resting atop a kind of hierarchy. And you can see that even here, men are viewed as being superior to women, to the ecocentric orientation up top, in which humans, animals, and even other forms of non-human life are also considered to be part of the greater ecosystem or greater social relations in which we exist. And so that's a much more dynamic and complex way of thinking about the relationships between humans and non-human entities. Then he closes this slide with a note from an author, Mosakas, who wrote on the moral status of social robots, considering the consciousness criterion, and he editorializes here that there's no evidence of anything like the fixed consciousness of animals, or he wrote animas, that demand moral concern. So why this is a bit troubling is that he uses this one article by one person to suggest that consciousness is perhaps the single or among the most important properties that are used to determine moral or legal status. But of course, what we know is that consciousness is simply one among many of what are called a properties-based approach to moral or legal status. Another one which has gained a lot of steam and which relates to animal ethics is sentience. And there's a whole movement called sentientism, which is focused on trying to elucidate how sentience is perhaps the single most important property through which animals should be granted moral or legal status. But what he misses here is the language of the actual intellectual debate that's going on when we talk about properties. Properties is one school of thought, but then there's another school of thought which he doesn't talk about, and that's relations. How we relate to other non-human entities, and whether that has something to do with the extent to which we welcome these non-humans into our moral or legal universes. And there's an ongoing and very rich debate about whether it's one property that is significant, or a group of properties, or it's properties and relations in tandem, or some kind of mixture of these, like David Gunkel and Mark Koeckelberg have talked about in their work. So we need to zoom out for a second when we're looking at the animal analogy here and realize that this is happening in the context of a much larger debate from within moral philosophy about how we make determinations about moral status. Another particular slide that follows this one that is worth mentioning here is as follows, and he refers to this as analogies for robot rights. And he talks about two different analogies, one which he argues the robot rightists are preferring, and that is one on civil rights. But again, you are unlikely to read any robot rights literature that specifically advocates for certain civil rights. In particular, no one is talking about a robot's right to education, a robot's right to vote, and so on. And yet, that seems to be the argument being put forth here. David Gunkel wrote a chapter in which he very carefully argues that this is one of the sort of flawed contentions brought up against the robot rights literature. So it suggests a lack of familiarity with the actual robot rights literature. And he says what are actually more in line with, in terms of an appropriate analogy, are corporate rights. And the irony here is that, and I talk about this in my book, that corporate rights in the United States context stand on a very, very flimsy and contingent legal basis that stems back decades based on a legal memo that was produced by a court reporter, and that kind of spiraled into what we now consider to be the rights of corporations. But that's also by virtue of them having satisfied the criteria for legal personhood here. So it's not clear that Frank is talking about moral rights or legal rights, although I think based on his area of expertise that he's probably talking about legal rights. But again, the irony, of course, is that corporate rights, even though he's advancing this as a more suitable analogy for robot rights, is actually not very robust and very contentious as well. However, when we want to look at the rights that people are perhaps likely to support in the future, we do have some initial empirical scholarship which sheds some light on this topic. There's a recent conference paper by Lima et al. Called Collecting the Public Perception of AI and Robot Rights. And what's really fascinating here is they do an empirical analysis of the kinds of rights that people would support robots having some claim to. And the one that stood out from their analysis is the right against cruel treatment, which actually suggests that the analogy to animals might be the most likely channel through which we see rights of robots and artificial intelligence to emerge. So, in summary, here are some of my primary criticisms of Frank's presentation. He does not cite a single peer-reviewed article or book on the subject of robot rights. He appears to conflate moral and legal rights. He makes red herring and straw man arguments, and he mischaracterizes animal ethics and environmental ethics. David Gunkel, who is the person who wrote the book on robot rights, which I'll talk about in a moment, has done this fantastic job of mapping out the scholars who have written on the subject. And as you can see at this point in 2021, there are a number of them. And what's really something important to draw your attention to is the fact that those think that robots should have rights or are at least open to it intellectually appear to at this point actually outnumber those who think that it is untenable, the idea that robots could have rights. But he chooses in his essay to focus specifically on a subset of those who view the rights of robots as unthinkable. And this does not adequately and accurately reflect the nature of the literature, and which you can see from this mapping done here. So if you're interested in the rights of robots, there are a number of books that have come out recently that I think are really worth your time. And so I'm just going to quickly show you a few of these that I think are particularly helpful. Of course, David Gunkel's book Robot Rights is really a standard bearer in the discipline, and really was what inspired me to write my book, which is the next one here on the list, Rights for Robots, Artificial Intelligence, Animal and Environmental Law. And then Tomasz Pietrzakowski wrote a really fascinating book on specifically looking at personhood. It's called Personhood Beyond Humanism, Animals, Chimeras, Autonomous Agents, and the Law. Again, taking a much more holistic view at these different non-human entities and the extent to which they might be afforded personhood. Visa Kirky wrote a fantastic book which looks at the more specific area of legal personhood. Joshua K. Smith has recently released a book, Robotic Persons, Our Future with Social Robots, which approaches the subject from a theological perspective, which is a welcome addition to the literature. And then this month, Kate Darling produced a brand new book called The New Breed, What Our History with Animals Reveals About Our Future with Robots, which is intended for a popular audience, but is a fantastic way of examining this relationship between humans and robots and animals. And she argues that actually looking to our relationship with animals is a much more productive way of producing an analogy that people will find helpful when looking at how the rights of robots or even just the status of robots in society is likely to proceed. So if you're someone who thinks of this as an important topic, or you're just curious about the intersection between animal rights and robot rights, I would encourage you to check out this upcoming online workshop, which is being organized by the Cambridge Center for Animal Rights Law on June 2nd, 2021. You can see it features a keynote address by Mark Cockleberg. I'm giving a talk on the rights for non-humans in the Anthropocene. Kate Darling is going to be talking about her book, and Tomasz Pietrzakowski is going to also talk about similarities and dissimilarities between animal and AI rights. And there'll be opportunities for discussion and Q&A at the end. So you can see the registration link there. I strongly encourage you to check this out if you're interested. It's going to be a very fascinating and, importantly, interdisciplinary conversation about what we understand to be the state of research on animal rights, robot rights, and the rights of nature. So I'm going to close out there. And I thank you for your time and attention. You can see a link to my open access book here, Rights for Robots. You can scan this with your the QR code and gain access to it and download it. If you want to touch base with me, feel free to drop me a line at my email address or touch base with me on Twitter or check out my website, joshgellers.com. So Thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to continuing this conversation with all of you.